And good evening. I am your host today, C.L. Edwards at Out of Islam, hashtag Out of Islam if you're looking for me on the internet. And we're here today live on the Trinity Channel. You can find us broadcasting live on the Trinity Channel trinitychannel.com. Please tell your friends, your neighbors, your co-workers, the Muslims next door, your Muslim relatives, the guy who works at the corner store, whoever you know, let them know about these programs and about the work that's being done at the Trinity Channel and ABN. As we've told you several times that we are broadcasting all over the world. We're broadcasting programs in 4 different languages. We're broadcasting across the world, across several different satellites into the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Europe, Australia, all over Europe, all over the world. And of course, we're online, and you can download the apps from the Apple Store, and you can listen even on your cell phone wherever you go. So there's no excuse not to tune in and watch us. And today we are here with our 3rd installment and our 3rd show today in English. We have, again, if you missed the show that we had earlier today, if you're in America, on the western half of the world here in the Eastern Standard Time that we are in broadcasting from, we had the Pfander group, and we had a thrilling discussion about Jesus versus Isa, Jesus of the Bible versus this person called Isa, who we find in Islam in the Quran. And we did make a distinction between these two. They're not the same thing. Jesus of the Bible and so-called Jesus of Islam, the Quran and the Hadith, are not the same persons. They are vastly different. There may be some similarities, but there are some very important differences. So when our Muslim friends and brothers and sisters in humanity, when you say to us, we believe in Jesus just like you do. No, not really, not quite. You believe some things that we believe, but there's some very important things that you do not believe. And we're going to continue this discussion further on, getting deeper into the subject here in this show. And we have with us today our guests, the same that we had this morning. We have Brother Jay Smith. We have Sister Sara Foster and Sister Beth Grove. Let me give everyone a short bio and introduction. For our Brother Jay Smith, he has been working with Muslims for over 30 years. He's in the last 23 years in London, England. Most of his time he spends traveling to numerous countries to teach Christians and Muslims about apologetics, polemics, which he has learned from weekly forays into the world-famous Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park in London. Skipping down a little bit, Jay has 2 master's degrees in divinity in Islamics, and he is currently finishing his PhD dissertation with Melbourne School of Theology in Australia under the supervision of Dr. Peter Riddell and Dr. Gordon Nicol. Jay is a veteran in this whole thing that we call Christian apologetics and polemics towards Islam. You can find him almost anywhere on the internet. But if you do a search on YouTube, you can look up Pfanderfilms, Pfander Media, Worlds Apart. He has some new material on YouTube about the historical critique of Islam and the Quran, which you can find on YouTube if you do a search for Jay Smith or the wordings of that particular lecture series. And also we have with us, we have Sara Foster. Sara Foster practiced law before joining the Pfander Center for Apologetics as a researcher, teacher, and administrator. She is passionate about the sharing of the gospel and enjoys interacting with Muslims in various ways. And lastly, but surely not least, We have Beth Grove. Born and raised on a missions field, she has lived among Muslim immigrant communities in London since 1997, enjoying friendship and dialogue with close Muslim friends from many nations. After traveling through Muslim countries, she has obtained a master's degree in Islamics and is one of the co-founders of the Pfander Center for Apologetics, which is a research think tank and teaching ministry to equip Christians worldwide to engage Islam with confident Christianity. And as we said in my last show, if you caught it, if you didn't, I'll remind you, we have a mandate we find in 1 Peter 3:15. It's a very famous passage that many people quote, but do you stop and think about it? It commands us to reverence the Lord Jesus Christ as Lord within our hearts. And that reverencing of Jesus Christ in our hearts should cause us to prepare ourselves to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within us to those who are outside of Jesus Christ, who do not know his love, his grace, and his salvation. So let's get into the show today. That was a mouthful. Our topic today is historical critique, historical problems within Islam. Again, historical problems within Islam. And we're going to start our questions off with our guest, Jay Smith. Jay, let me ask you this question. What is the classical account for Muhammad? Some would call the accounts of the Sara, the biography of Muhammad. Could you explain that to us?
Well, thanks, Yale. This is probably the area that we're going to be looking at tonight is probably my favorite area. This is the area I have spent over 20 years investigating. I did my very first debate in 1995 at Cambridge University with Dr. Jamal Badawi on this very material. Some of it we're going to talk about and unpack for people here. Now, for any Muslims who are watching, it's going to be difficult to hear what we're going to do in the next hour and a half. The reason why is you have been taught a certain classical standard belief. Everybody has been taught basically the same narrative, the same story. You've all been told that this man named Muhammad, born in 570, he was born in Mecca. He then started receiving revelations in 510 up there in a cave called the Hira Cave. And from 610 to 622, he received the Meccan revelations. He was persecuted. He was a minority. From 622, then he had the Hijrah, which is the Exodus, the movement from Mecca to Medina, a city that used to be called Yathrib, northeast of Mecca, and he went with about 80 to, some say, as much as 200 followers. And when he moved to Medina, then he tried to have a relationship with the Jews to ameliorate the differences between the Jews and the Ansar, certainly the secular Arabs that were there that controlled the economy. It didn't work. After about 2 years, that broke down, and so for 624, then he then started confronting the Jews. And of course, that is the beginning of the Khilafah. The Khilafah means the Islamic State, was inaugurated in 624. From 622 then to 632, that last 10 years, he then continued to receive revelations called the Medinan revelations, the first, roughly the first 20 surahs, the first 20 chapters of the Quran. And he not only started taking over Medina, by 624 he started driving the Jews out. The Banu Kainuka family in 624, the Banu Nadir family in 625, and then finally the Banu Qurayza family in 627, slitting off the throats of 800 of their men in one afternoon, taking the women as concubines for his men and the children as slaves. Now, by 630, then he goes back down to Mecca, takes over Mecca, and then with 2 years later, he suddenly dies, and possibly poisoned. We don't know. Abu Bakr takes over for 2 years, from 632 to 634. After that comes Umar, who takes over from 634 to 644. Then comes Uthman, the third caliph, from 644 to 656. And then finally Ali, from 656 to 661, when he was killed at the Battle of Siffin with Muawiyah. Now, from 624 to 666, that is the 40-year period called the Rashidun period, the golden period of Islam, when everything happened. That is what all the Muslims want to get back to. That's what ISIS wants to get back to. And that's what all even moderate Muslims want to get back to. That golden age, the beginning of the Caliphate in 624 to the death of Ali in 651, known as the period of the four rightly guided caliphs. Now, Here's the problem. That's the classical model. It's what all of us have been told. There's no reason to doubt that model. I've never, for 33 years of working with Muslims, had any reason to try to critique it, to try to suggest that maybe there is another story. We were not permitted to do that. Nothing really came down the tube until we started asking some disturbing questions. And what I would like Beth now to do, and that's the next question we're going to go into, is what is the problem with that classical account?
Yes, that's what I was thinking while you were saying this. When did all this come about? When was it all gathered together? When was it all put into a nice, neat book for us to read and marvel at the glorious Islamic past of Muhammad and his rightly guided caliphs? Beth, when was the classic account written down?
Yeah, it's quite different from what the Muslims are saying, especially if you look at the Islamic texts. Muslims, to know about their history, have to go to writers who were writing a few hundred years after these events happened. So the main thing to remember is when Muhammad died. He died in 632. So it's from 632, and as Jay said, that golden period that was happening, where by 650, Uthman had apparently compiled the Quran, and in that golden period of the four rightly guided caliphs, apparently this is when everything happened. But the problem is for Muslims is that the first actual writings of this from Islamic sources doesn't happen until 200 years later. Now, Muslims will go to Ibn Ishaq. That's who they say wrote the first biography of Muhammad. So to know about the life of Muhammad, which of course is very, very important to Muslims, because over and over in the Quran it says that in Muhammad you have an example to follow. What Allah and Muhammad, or what Allah and his messenger have decreed, you have no choice in the matter. That's in Surah 33. There's many verses that say that you must obey Allah and you must obey the messenger. You must obey the messenger, you must obey Allah. And of course, all of this, Muslims then have to look at that, and they have to look at the life of Muhammad. Well, to know about the life of Muhammad, you have to go to the Sirah Rasulullah, which is the Sirah is the biography of Muhammad. You have to go to the sayings of Muhammad and his practices, how he lived. That is called the Hadith. You have to go to the histories, which is Tariq. You have to go to the Tafsir, which is the commentaries or the interpretations of the Quran. So Muslims will go to Ibn Ishaq. The problem is we don't have Ibn Ishaq's writing. We don't even know if Ibn Ishaq really did write. But according to Islamic tradition, there is writings from Ibn Ishaq, which they then see as written down by Ibn Hisham. So we go to Ibn Hisham. His dates are 833. Remember, Muhammad died 632. So if Ibn Hisham is the first written biography from Islamic sources, that is 200 years after Muhammad lived, that we begin to find out a written record of his life and his practices. Then you have the Hadith, and we go to Sahih Bukhari. He's one of the main ones, certainly for Sunni Muslims, and his dates are 870. That's even later. That's more than 200 years. There's others like Sahih Muslim, Al-Tirmidhi, he's 892. These are some of the most important Sahih, if you like, those who are seen as authoritative writers of the sayings and the doings, if you like, or the practices of Muhammad. You go to the Tafsir. Al-Tabari is probably the biggie there. His dates are 923. And he is both Tafsir, that is the commentaries, and also he would be the history. And he has there's 40 volumes of his work that you can have to look at the history of Islam. What is interesting is the later the writings come, so you have Ibn Hisham, then you have Al-Waqidi, and his dates are 835, and he wrote maybe about 50 years or so after Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham. And when you look at Al-Waqidi, he has more details than the earlier one. Then when you come to Al-Tabari in the 10th century, he has even more details. So it seems as time went on, suddenly they were adding more and more details to the story in the life of Muhammad. So for the historian, this is very suspect. How is it that it took 200 years to write these stories down? Compare it to the Bible. the Bible, we know, within 60 years had written down the account, the Sira, if you like, the biography of Jesus, that had been written down within 60 years. And so compare that with the Bible. It would be, if we were like the Islamic sources, it would be as if it took to the 2nd and 3rd century for the Bible, for the New Testament to be written down. We know that's not the case at all. So with Islam, there's great problems for them, because how can you trust something that was written 200 years after Muhammad lived? It's just very untrustworthy. And this is what has got historians beginning to reconsider the history of Islam and to look at other areas like documentary evidence, manuscript evidence, and archaeological evidence, which we're really going to unpack tonight.
Okay. So far we've got that there's a classic account of Muhammad's bio called the Sira. Traditionally, when we look at the when would this have been compiled and written down, we see that reality is that most of this information wasn't put down, codified into 200 years after the death of Muhammad. Now, the next question I will put to Sara. Sara, what do 21st century scholars, our modern day scientific method, critical thinking scholars of today, what do they say about all this in the bio of Muhammad and the traditions of Islam concerning him?
Well, scholars have looked at this and they seem to be quite concerned. We're getting statements like Islam, as we know it, did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of about 200 to 300 years. Another statement that we're getting is the Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, or over 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of about 50 to 100 years. And this is the conclusion that many modern scholars are coming to. And when I say modern, I mean like Western secular scholars, scholars that will want to look at the evidence, look at what happened, and make conclusions based on whatever external evidence they can find. The history of Islam, this is what they're saying, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul al-Malik and before, is a later fabrication. Now this is devastating, a later fabrication. This is saying that we cannot trust these earlier accounts, as Beth has just said. And so I think the question is, why are they saying this? I mean, it's okay to make a statement like that, but, you know, as scholars, they would have had to back it up. And the reason that they're saying it is that there doesn't seem to be a good reason why the accounts are so late. I mean, if Muhammad dies in 632 and we're not seeing any kind of biographies or any kind of sayings of Muhammad until 238 years later, this is a massive problem. This is a massive problem. And so they're looking at it and just asking, why on earth did it take so long? Is it that the people were illiterate? And that can't be the case. The people clearly were able to read and write. We know that Muhammad had scribes. Zayd ibn Thabit comes to mind, who would write down the revelation as it came. And then we know that the sources tell us that Uthman gathered them together. Abu Bakr kind of gathered them together and collated them. So there shouldn't be the excuse that they couldn't write anything down. And also remember, their resources were just vast at this time. From the 7th century, or by the end of the 7th century, they had control of Spain all the way in the west to India all the way in the east. We know that these were literate countries. We think of Alexandria, that had the great library. So when we see that Islam had control of cities like Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, great cities of that time who had literate people, they were writing, there really is no excuse not to write down the biography and the sayings of Muhammad. I mean, if this is the most important person at this particular time and people could write, why on earth are they not writing down these sayings? Are they not that important? I mean, if something happens, it's people's natural tendency to write it down. So there isn't the excuse that they couldn't read or write. There's no excuse that they couldn't take the opportunity for those writing in literate countries to write down the biography and the Sira. Also, it's so different to Christianity because at that time, Christians, in their first 300 years, Christians were persecuted. They didn't have the money to go out and get the vellum, which is the animal skin, very expensive animal skin, to write things down. There was this edict as well in 303 AD, which says to burn all the churches, to destroy all the churches, burn all the Christian literature, also to destroy or confiscate all the items used for worship. Christians were banned for worshipping. So we can understand why we don't get massive volumes of writing at that time, but even throughout all of that persecution, we do have papyri going back to the 2nd century. The Rhinos papyri is dated 112, and it was meant to be written in the 1st century. We have papyri, but we don't see that with Islam, unfortunately. So the question is, can we trust these traditions? The best thing to do in this case, and what scholars will do and have done, is to go back to the 7th century and see exactly what evidence. Why are we relying on 9th century documents? Let's go right back to the 7th century and see what we can find. And as I've said, there shouldn't be any reason. Islam, the people who we now call Muslims and came out of Arabia, they were not oppressed, they were not persecuted, they were ruling right from the 7th century, and much of the territory that they conquered, they haven't let go of. So really, again, there isn't a reason or an excuse why we don't have earlier biographies, earlier sayings, earlier histories.
Yes, I would agree with you. Everything you said, I concur with you. There are hadiths saying that Muhammad had scribes, that they were writing down on trunks of trees and leaves or anything they could possibly find. Muslims claim from their primary sources that that the Quran was compiled and the canon was created within the lifetime of the rightly guided Khulafa. There were many writings and edicts going forth. There are letters from Muhammad supposedly going out to certain kings and rulers. So why couldn't they write the biography of Muhammad? That's a very odd question. You also touched on what the concerns of the scholars would be over this. That what I just said is a huge concern. That should be a huge concern to any Muslim who is watching this, who has an open mind and who is really trying to find the truth and really trying to investigate information open-mindedly. Let me go on to our next question here. Jay, let me add, we've been talking about the scholars say, and the scholars say about the biography of Muhammad, and the scholars say about the later writing down of his biography. Who are the scholars? Who are these scholars exactly?
Yeah, CL, I think it's important that we do ask this question. Otherwise, it could just be our opinion. It just could be our own research. We need to go and look and see who are the ones who are involved in this. And what you're going to find is that they are the best and the brightest who are asking these questions. Let me give you some names. Right at the top of the list, probably the one we should start with is Dr. John Wansborough. He was the one that blew open this whole idea of revisionist history, looking back and saying, we've got a problem with these late dates that Beth was referring to. He had written two books in the 1977 and 1978, one called Quranic Studies and the other called Sectarian Milieu. These two books went back and looked at the Quran, looked at all of the literary devices in the Quran, and noticed that many of the stories, much of the poetry, could not have existed in Central Arabia in the 7th century. These stories existed much further north, up in places like Ctesiphon, which later became Baghdad, Damascus, and would have been in libraries way up there, but these stories would not have been in a nomadic environment so close to where Mecca and Medina are, which just had no literary tradition. When he brought this out and he started making these accusations, say that possibly, therefore, the Quran was put together at a later date, he got death threats here in London. He was head of department here at Oriental and African Studies, and he quickly changed his studies and went over and studied instead trade law in Paris because of the death threat, which is really sad. Dr. Gerald Hawting was one of his students, and I studied under Gerald Hawting in 1994 at School of Oriental and African Studies. He was head of department at that time, and he was the one that introduced me to this material. So we're talking about over 20 years ago, 21 years ago, when I first heard it, and blew my mind open. I'd already had a master's degree from Fuller Seminary. I thought I knew everything there was to know about the history of Islam until I sat under Dr. Hawting. Dr. Hawting within 2 weeks of his class, 20 of the students of the 50 that were in his class, all Muslims, had left the class, slamming the door as they left, yelling at him, calling him names, abusing him. And all he was doing was just showing them what they're finding, what these scholars are finding, what Dr. Wansborough found. Dr. Patricia Corona out of Denmark. Dr. Patricia Corona was head of department at Oxford University. Now, she reads and writes 15 languages. She is a huge scholar. I don't know of anybody that can equal her. She just died 2 months ago. She wrote a book called Hagerism with Dr. Michael Cook, looking at a what-if scenario. And then she wrote another book called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. We're going to talk about that when we get to Mecca in 1987. Because of that book, which destroyed any notion that there was a city called Mecca in the 7th century, she had to leave Oxford because she got death threats and went to Cambridge University, became head of department there. That's where I got to know her. She helped me when I was beginning my doctorate. And in fact, my debate that I did in 1995 with Dr. Jamal Badawi was almost all her material. She was the one that helped me put it together. Now, that debate has not been answered, and that's been over 20 years ago. Now, she then went to Princeton University, was head of department there, and continued to write about this historical problem. Dr. Andrew Rippon was another one of this same group. He was in Calgary, and he wrote the book Muslims, Their Beliefs and Practices. Dr. Robert Hoyland, another one who I got to know in Oxford University, he reads and writes 18 languages. So these are linguists. These are people who write languages that no longer exist today. They read languages that no longer exist today. And that's why they're going back to the original sources, and that's why they're so dangerous. Dr. Yehuda Neville, who wrote Crossroads to Islam, the origins of the Arab religion and Arab state. He was the one that actually went back to the original inscriptions on many of the rocks that they find in the Negev desert. And we're going to say a little bit about what he found. And then, of course, the German school are the ones who have been at the forefront of the manuscript evidence. Dr. Gunther Luling, Dr. Gerd Quinn, Dr. von Boltmer, Dr. Olig. These are some of the best scholars in the world today on the Arabic text, on the Arabic manuscripts, on the Quranic manuscripts. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that later on in this program. So these are the best in the world. You don't get any better than names like this. And I'm just giving you 10 of probably the best known ones. There are many others that I could quote, but I think we can go with that. Now, let me just also say there have been 2 books and a documentary that have just come out in the 2012. Which have blown this open for the layman, because most of these authors that I'm talking about write for academics, and their level of writing is way up here. Dr. Patricia Corona, when she writes, she sometimes keeps every one of her quotes in the original language, so you cannot understand what the quotes are. She's assuming that you're a scholar like her. People who have brought that kind of material down to layman's terminology are people like Dr. Tom Holland, who in 2012 wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Sword. If you want to find the one book that puts it all together, what we're saying tonight, that's probably the best book to get. He takes all this difficult material, historical material, and he puts it into layman's terminology. He then came out with a documentary called Islam, the Untold Story in 2012. It's only an hour and a half long. You can go up on YouTube and see it. Taking much of the material there and putting it into a documentary form so people could see it. Now, that documentary was only shown one time on Channel 4 here in London. When they wanted to show it a second time in November of 2012, there was such an uproar from the Muslim community here that they didn't show it a second time. And you'll see why when you watch the documentary. I encourage any of you to watch it. But then the book that I would like to recommend the most is called Quranic Geography, written by Dan Gibson. And Sara later on is going to unpack what he is saying. That book you can get up online. Just go up on Google and Google in Quranic Geography PDF. It'll cost you $15. That's all it will cost. And you'll bring the whole thing down onto your computer and read it and look and see what he found. Here's a man. He is an archaeologist. His father was an archaeologist. His grandfather was an archaeologist. He grew up in an archaeological family. He spent 20 years there in Arabia amongst the Bedouins, learned their language, and started opening the Quran and looking for all these geographical locations. And it's this material that we're going to introduce tonight. And I'm going to let's stop there and let the others now start unpacking some of the things that they have found.
Well, thank you very much. And I will be looking up this documentary, Islam, the Untold Story, tonight. And if my wife gets mad, I'll tell her that you told me to go look it up.
Blame it. I'll take credit.
Now, we've gone through Muhammad's biography, what Muslims say about it, what the scholars have said about it, who the scholars are. Now, I pose this question to Beth. What are the findings of these scholars concerning early Islam? What are they saying about early Islam?
Well, if you remember what Sara was talking about earlier, where within a few years of Muhammad dying in 632, and that's an important date to remember, we judge everything by that date. By 630, after 632, Muslims had spread very quickly into Africa, going north and going east and west. They were just going everywhere, and they were conquering big cosmopolitan cities. They were conquering places like Jerusalem, Damascus, Cairo, and so on, Basra, Baghdad. And so, according to Islamic tradition, they had become sophisticated, an entity that was already in play. They were seeing themselves as Muslims and Islam, the religion of Islam. Apparently, there was this prophet called Muhammad, and so on. But what is interesting, for the first 60 years after Muhammad's death in 632, we do not find any reference to a man called Muhammad in any Arabic inscriptions. And in fact, the first reference to a prophet called, or a man called Muhammad, or prophet called Muhammad in Arabic writing, Arabic inscriptions, doesn't happen until 691. And what is interesting is we see a lot of these inscriptions and ideas of Muhammad begin to start with the Dome of the Rock. So we have no reference of Muhammad until 691. We have no reference to a people or a sort of religious people group called Muslims. And this is very interesting because they were recognized. There was a recognized marauding, raiding band of people, but they were not called Muslims. They'd come up from Arabia. They were called Saracens. They were called Hagarenes. They were called Mahajirun, which of course a radical Muslim group today has taken its name from. They were called Ishmaelites. They were called Saracens, but they were not called Muslims. That's very important. So they were recognized by really their tribal connections, not so much by a religion or a people called Muslims who belong to a religion called Islam. And of course, we don't see the religion, a name of a religion called Islam, until 691. We don't see Muslims till 690. We don't see the religion of Islam until 691, that name. We also don't see the city of Mecca. Remember, Mecca is the center of Islam. It's where every Muslim, if they can, goes to once in their lifetime for a pilgrimage. We don't see a reference to Mecca until 741 in any Arabic inscriptions. That's profound. Muhammad died 632. Mecca is the mother of all settlements in the Quran. Apparently, that's what Muslims say. Mecca is the heart of Islam. It's where everyone prays towards 5 times a day. It is the place where you go to on a Hajj. What is interesting is Mecca, not only was it not first found on an Arabic inscription until 741, it is not on any map until 900. So this apparent place where Abraham went and destroyed all the idols, that is the heart of the Islamic religion, is the place that's center of Muhammad's activities and at the center of Islamic religion. It's not even on a map until 900. And what is interesting is that Mecca, according to Islamic tradition, is supposed to be the heart of all trade. Mecca is supposed to be where all the trade routes came through. But if that is the case, why on earth is it not on a map until 900? Then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, you have the biography of Muhammad. That's not written down until 833 by Ibn Hisham. Do you see how late these dates were? If Islam is a big, powerful religion, led by a prophet called Muhammad, by a religious group called Muslim, why on earth is there no reference of them until 60 years later? We're going to see later on in the program why that is the case, and an alternative reading of history that is probably closer to the truth than what we find from the Islamic traditions.
Yes, very interesting, especially the part where you mentioned that Mecca was not seen on any map until 900. I didn't know that. Yes. I just found, you just informed me of that. I didn't know that.
It should be 800, not 900.
800? 800.
Yeah.
But still, that's still late. That's still late.
9th century, but 800.
It doesn't make it better. Definitely. Now, this next question is to Sara. can you explain the geographic problems in the Quran?
Yeah, so Jay introduced the book by Dan Gibson, Quranic Geography. Very interesting book. I highly recommend it. And what he looks at is, as Jay said, is all the geographical references in the Quran. And he compares them to the Bible, he compares them, and he wants to see, can he actually find the places as they should be in the Quran? He finds that there are 65 references to geographical places, and it actually refers to just 9 locations. So it's just 9 locations in the whole of the Quran, and they're referred to different times. I want to compare that to the Gospel of Luke, just one Gospel in the Bible. It has 110 references, and it's referring to 31 locations. So we can see straight away in the Quran, very, very few locations and very, very few references for, for the whole of the Quran. But anyway, so he looks at these 65 references, these 9 locations, and there's 3 very important ones. The first one is Ad. It comes up about 23 times it's referred to. Then you have the people of Thalmud, that's 24 times it's referred to, and then Midian, that's referred to 7 times. These are the main references in the Quran, and they actually account for 83% of the references that we find, geographic references in the Quran. Now, what's very interesting, what he found is that these places are not close to Mecca. They're not close to Mecca. They're actually 600 miles north of Mecca. And why that's interesting is because in the Quran, Muhammad is meant to be interacting with the people from Ad and the people from Thamuz and the people from Midian. But how can he be interacting? If he starts his life in Mecca, that's where he spends most of his, part of his time as a prophet. But these people are not in Mecca and they're not near Medina. They're actually a lot further north. Then how is it we kind of see a disparity there? So this is what Dan Gibson was looking at. And then it brings up a lot of questions. Why is it that we don't see these places close to Mecca, Mecca being in southern Arabia, and these places being much closer in northern Arabia, much further north? And then there's the other question, in terms of Muhammad's name. Muhammad's name is only mentioned 4 times in the Quran. And the rest of the time we see in parentheses, we see somebody saying, and then we see, oh, Muhammad in parentheses. So when we're seeing the name Muhammad, it's actually 4 times in the Arabic. And that brings up a question as well. So when it's talking about, oh, prophet, how do we know it's talking about the prophet Muhammad as we know it today by the Islamic sources or what Muslim tells us? And as Beth has already said, if we're not sure about Mecca, and it seems to be so late, how do we know that the prophet is in the place of Mecca, today's location of Mecca? There's so many questions that it blows up just by looking at the geography. This is what Dan Gibson did. And so these are concerns that scholars are having with regards to the Quranic geography.
Oh, thank you very much. Again, the title of the show is Historical Critique and Historical Problems with Islam. And if you've been tuning in so far, you have heard numerous historical issues that are in the Quran and the religion of Islam and other primary sources of the religion of Islam, the Hadith, the Sara, all the claims concerning Mecca being a place of trade. So I direct this question, and I'm very interested in the answer to this question right here, to Jay. Can you unpack for us what exactly is this issue, this problem going on with Mecca that we see?
Yeah, this is where the rubber starts to hit the road, CL. You're going to start enjoying it now. When you look at Mecca, stop and think, what do we know about Mecca? Well, we've already heard that it's the center of Islam. We know that. Every Muslim knows that, but it goes much further back. When you go back to Surah 7, Ayah 24, Adam and Eve are up in space, right? They're in a Garden of Eden that's up in space. They're thrown out of the Garden of Eden in chapter 7, verse 24, and they're thrown down to earth. Now, according to the tradition, they're thrown down to Mecca. So the first inhabitants of mankind is Mecca. That's pretty important. We're also told in Surah 21 that Abraham is in Mecca. I had no idea that Abraham was from Mecca, but there it is in Surah 21, so, ayah 51 to 71. He's in Mecca. So in 1900 BC, Abraham is in Mecca, proving that it's a very old city. Montgomery Watt, the famous Orientalist, talked about the trade route theory, how that all the trade had to go through Mecca, going north, south, east, and west, and that's what made Mecca so great. That's what made it so rich. So what we're hearing, and Muslims have always agreed with this, and this is why they've jumped on to what Montgomery Watt was saying. Yes, that's what made it big. That's what made it rich. Dr. Patricia Corona was looking at a map. I'll just hold it up to the camera here. This map right here that I'm pointing to. She was looking at this map, and as she looked at it carefully, she noticed that it's a 7th century map, but the trade route going up the west coast of Mecca, which is where you have all the major cities going up along the western plateau. You have at the very bottom, you have Aden, you have Najran, you have Sana, you have Taif, you have Yathrib, you have Tabuk, you have Khaybar, and then you have Gaza in the north. Those are the trade route that goes up the western plateau. But take a look at those names. Mecca is not on that trade route. Doesn't exist. As Beth said, there is no reference to Mecca. Now, Dr. Patricia Corona was curious about this back in the 1980s, and so she decided to do some homework. Now, remember, she speaks, reads, and writes 15 languages. So she went back to all the original documents from all the trading documents, and she found out that there was no trade through Mecca at all. All the trade coming from, in your case, from from India and China in the east, coming over towards the west, went across the Arabian Gulf. It used to go up through the Persian Gulf. That got shut down because the Sassanids and the Byzantines, that's the Persians and the Christians, were warring with each other for 200 years. Shut down the trade, so it had to be redirected down over to Aden. And then, of course, according to the trade route theory, it went right up the western plateau. She said, hold on a minute, take a look at the map again. And if any of you have a map in front of you, I'll just put this one up here in front of the camera. If you look at the map, you'll see there's a problem with that theory. Maybe you can see it real quickly. Can you notice on the western side of Arabia is a waterway called the Red Sea? She said, why would they take off all the goods off the ships down in Aden and go 1,250 miles by land when they had a waterway that went up the western on the western side of Arabia? So she decided to go back to all these trading documents. She knew all their languages, read them all, the originals, and she found that there was no trade whatsoever that went up through Arabia. It all went up the Red Sea. It was so much cheaper. More than that, she noticed that if you look and you'll see the trade routes maps, the maps that were there, nothing refers to Mecca at all in any of the trade route maps. She decided to write a book called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987. And when she looked at that book, she noticed, when she was writing that book, she noticed that she wanted to find out what these spices were that supposedly made Mecca rich. So she went to all 15 spices, found that all of them either came from the Far East or Africa. Only 2 spices came from Arabia at all. That was frankincense and myrrh. And they did not go up through Mecca. That was down in the southern part, the Hadramaut, which is Yemen and Oman today. They went up by ship, up against the Red Sea. In every case, there was no reference to any trade going through a place called Mecca. And the only trade that went up the western plateau was leather and milk. Not much to build an empire on.
I would think not.
Now, Gibson, let's get back to Gibson, because Dan Gibson also was asking the same question about this place called Mecca. He looked at these geographical areas to this settlement, and he looked at all the references in both the traditions and also in the Quran to the settlement where this prophet came from, who has no name, as Sara said. And it was either Beth or Sara mentioned this. He has no name. He's just referred to as the messenger, the settlement, the messenger, the settlement of the messenger, of the prophet. And the settlement is only referred to one time. In fact, Mecca is only found once in the entire Quran, in Arabic, and that's in Surah 48, Ayah 24. That's it. Doesn't say much about it. But what he noticed is that this settlement was in a valley. It had a stream going through it. It had a parallel valley, had a pillar of salt, had fields, trees, grass, clay, loam, olive trees. And as this prophet went out in the morning, he passed the pillar of salt. When he came back in the evening, he passed the same pillar of salt. That pillar being the wife of Lot. If that is the case, look and see if any of these references make sense for Mecca. Mecca is not in a valley. It does not have a parallel valley. It has no water going through it, certainly no stream. It does not have any clay, loam, grass. It has no Olive tree. There are no olive trees at all in Arabia. Olive trees only grow around the Mediterranean, 600 miles further north. Oh, have we heard 600 miles before already tonight? Beth talked about 600 miles. 600 miles further north, something was up there. We're not going to get to that yet. We still want to keep with Mecca because we have a little problem here. If there's nothing about Mecca in any of these maps, as Beth said, the first map is 800 AD. That's the 9th century. It's not referred to at all until 741 in any documentation. And this is not just Arab documentation, any documentation. The first reference that Dr. Patricia Crone could find was not till 741. Now, we have, and that is in the Apocalypse of Pseudo Methodius Continuata Byzantia Arabic. That's a big mouthful, don't have to memorize it. The big problem with that is, if that is the case, then what in the world and where is this place called Mecca? Why is it no one's been able to find it? I made this statement back in 1994. Sorry, 1995. 20 years ago. 21 years ago now. 21 years ago, we put my debate up on the debate website. They've had now 21 years to try to find and answer the question of Mecca. We're now 21 years later, and they have yet to find out why is it Mecca is not referred to at all for over 100 years. What's more, take a look at what they're doing to Mecca today. If you were to look at pictures of Mecca, you will see all these big, huge building projects. You'll see that enormous clock tower, the 4th largest, tallest building in the world that is now in Mecca. Take a look at some of the pictures. I'll just hold up some of them for you so you can see what Mecca is looking like today. It is becoming basically it's becoming a huge building project. They're building 52 of these skyscrapers. There's the clock tower next to Big Ben. It's much bigger than Big Ben, of course. The clock tower itself is 45 meters across. They have now covered up Muhammad's home. They've also covered up Khadija's wife's home. Why are they cementing all this place up? I would suggest they now know what we know. Mecca has no history. It looks like Mecca was chosen at a later date. Well, if Mecca was chosen at a later date, then you're going to have a problem with the Qibla, because everybody knows that everybody must pray in one direction 5 times a day. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, you need to pray towards Mecca. I'm going to let now Sara unpack what we now know about the Qibla, and here's where it really gets exciting.
Yes, the Qibla, very important. We know that Mecca is the center of worship for Muslims. All the Muslims who are planning on making surah prayers are going to face the Qibla. And here we're broadcasting from the east coast of America. In about an hour, Muslims will be praying Maghrib prayer, and they will all be facing the Qibla. So Sara, can you tell us about the new findings concerning the Qibla? What are the new findings concerning this point of prayer for the Muslims?
Well, the Qibla is very important, as you and Jay said. It's the direction of prayer. And in the Quran, in Surah 2, Ayah 143 to 150, it talks about the time where Muhammad received revelation that the direction of prayer would be turned towards Mecca. It would be turned towards Mecca. And then the Islamic traditions tell us that this happens in 624. So we should see every mosque from 624 being pointed, or the Qibla, being pointed in the direction of Mecca. This is what we should see. Unfortunately, we don't actually see that. Again, we're using Dan Gibson's material. He's done some wonderful material. Again, this is the book, if you want to get it. It's Quranic Geography by Dan Gibson. Before Dan Gibson actually went into this, there were 2 scholars that had a look at this, and that's Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fahavari. They actually went to Iraq and they went to Egypt in 1905, and they looked at 3 mosques. The 2 mosques that they looked at in Iraq were the Wasit Mosque and the Kufa Mosque. And what they did is they dug down to the original floor plans to see which way the Qibla was facing. And then they did the same in Egypt with the Fustat Mosque. They dug down to see where the Qibla was facing to know which direction people were praying in. And to their surprise, it was not facing Mecca. It was actually facing Petra. All 3 of them, the Qibla was facing Petra. Now, they thought this was very curious. And then they left. They left it there. And nothing really was done until Dan Gibson decided to have a look at this issue. Now, as Jay's already said, he is coming from a a family of archaeologists. He is a scholar, he's a historian, he's taken this very seriously, 20 years of research that we're going to look at. And what he decided to do is he wanted to try and find all the earliest mosques that he could do in the world, across the world, all the earliest mosques that he could find. And where he could find go down to the floor plans, he would take aerial shots in space. He'd use satellites to take shots of the original floor plans to determine which way the Qibla was facing. And these are the findings. I'm just going to read them as there's a list. He went to the Great Mosque of Guangzhou in China. Now this was built in 630 AD. Remember, the Quran is telling us, the Islamic traditions are telling us that by 624, every mosque should be pointing towards Mecca. But in 630, 6 years later, it's not pointing towards Mecca. The Qibla is facing Petra. We have the mosque in Western Jordan. Again, this one was built in 700 AD, so a long time after the Qibla was changed by Allah. But Muslims were not following Allah's direction. The mosque was pointing to Petra and not Mecca. We have the Great Mosque of Baalbek in Lebanon. Again, this was built in 700 AD, not facing Mecca, it was facing Petra. The Great Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen, this one was built in 705. Again, not facing Mecca, it was facing Petra. The Alaska Mosque in Jerusalem, this was 709. A great time for it to be pointing to Mecca, but it's not, it's pointing towards Petra. We have the Damascus Mosque in 709. Again, it's facing Petra and not Mecca. The Anjar Mosque in Lebanon. Again, this is 714. Really, there's no excuse. This is almost 100 years after Revelation came down that all mosques should be facing Mecca. This one is facing Petra. We have the Mosque of Ummah in Bosra, Syria. This one is 720. And again, it's not facing Mecca, it's facing Petra. We have the mosque in Pakistan facing Mecca. This is 727. Now, over 100 years after the canonization of the new direction of prayer, not facing Mecca, is facing Petra. We have this mosque in Syria, 728, not facing Mecca, is facing Petra. And now we see in the next couple of mosques, there's a little bit of change. We see the Ammon Mosque, it's got lower buildings, and that mosque was built in 700 AD. That one is facing Petra, but then it has upper buildings built in 740, and that one's actually facing Mecca. So we start to see the change, the swing towards the correct canonization after 100 years when it was meant to be changed. We see the Mashuta Mosque in Ammon. This one is still facing Petra in 743, so that one hasn't got the memo yet. We see the mosque in Tunisia, 770. This one's not even facing Petra or Mecca, it's just off the map. And the Cordoba Mosque in Spain, this is 784. Again, it's neither facing Petra or Mecca, it's doing its own thing. We see the Great Mosque in Karaoun, forgive my pronunciation, this mosque in Tunisia, again, 1817. This is almost 200 years after Revelation came down saying all mosques should be facing Mecca. This one is not facing Mecca or Petra, it's still confused. And it's not until 822 that we begin to see all mosques starting to face Mecca. So this is a major issue. If Muhammad is receiving revelation, divine revelation from Allah, if Muslims, they live to serve Allah, they serve Allah, they would want to make sure that they carry out what Allah is telling them to do. They would want to ensure that all their mosques, all the Qiblas are facing Mecca. But we don't see this straight away. It takes up to 100 years and then almost 200 years for all the mosques to be facing Mecca. I would say this is a massive problem.
It sounds like a massive problem. It doesn't make sense to me. If you have a Quran, you have a codified Quran, it's being shipped out all across to the various underlings of the Caliph in various places they've conquered. It says that everyone is supposed to face Mecca, but then people are building mosques that don't face Mecca, and they're facing some place called Petra. Petra, now, I'm going to ask Beth about this, but first we're going to take a break. So I'm just going to plant that seed in the viewer's mind, Petra. Just remember that. Why are these moths facing Petra? What is it about Petra that's so important? And we're going to ask Beth when we get back from our break. Please don't go anywhere. Stay tuned.
Watch our shows on the following platforms, such as Android tablets, Android boxes, Android phones, a Chromecast stick, your smart TV, or a Roku stick. For more information, please call the number on your screen or visit us at trinitychannel.com.
It is not you who chose me, but I who chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you.
Just asking a clarification on your answer. Saudi Arabia is the perfect picture of Islam, and you support the royal family of Saudi Arabia. You support that government.
We are called to bear fruit that will last. Here at ABN, we pray for support in allowing this fruit, which is spreading the word of God throughout the nations, to grow. Currently, ABN is broadcasting to more than 4 continents worldwide on 3 major satellites, including North America, Europe, Australia, North Africa, and the Middle East.
The Lord Jesus Christ is God who's come to rescue and save us. He took my sin, my shame, my pain.
بأنك تكون مقطوع الخير في الخلق والإحسان والصفات الحميدة.
بخصوص نكاح محمد لزينب زوجة زيد.
At some point, you have to have a first cause, an uncaused cause, or an uncreated creator.
رؤساء الكهنة لم يطلبوا من يهوذا ليدلهم من المسيح، ولكن أين مكان المسيح؟
Jesus Christ took my place. He was my representative.
أنا اليوم دا أرهب وأقتل ابن البلد الأصيل اللي أنا جيت احتليت بلده.
When we defend these things, we give glory and praise to God.
حسب عقيدتك عيسى ما خلق السماوات، بس يسوع المسيح هو الله عندنا.
Live with God the Father and Jesus and the Holy Spirit in the next life.
الناس خرجت في الشوارع ولا تخاف الموت.
We are calling onto you to help allow the fruit to last by supporting our ministry. Please send your donations to the address at your screen. P.O. Box 724, Walled Lake, Michigan 48390. Or you can also donate through our ABN app. Or call the numbers at your screen. Did you know that ABN has been on air for 10 years and started broadcasting to North America through the Galaxy 19 satellite? Now ABN and Trinity Channel programs are being aired to 4 continents through 3 different satellites. These satellites cover North America, Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. One of these satellites is Nilesat, the most popular satellite in the Middle East. Though the coverages are great and our passion is to spread the word of God to as many countries as possible in 4 different languages, this mission definitely has a big cost in our airtime. We are here to ask for your prayers and your support in bringing the truth from the word of God to the whole world and to set people free. You can support ABN in 4 different ways. Please visit our website at trinitychannel.com and click donate. You can go through the ABN apps, or you can send your check to the P.O. Box listed below, or you can call the numbers at your screen.
Yes, we are back here on ABN, the Trinity Channel. You're viewing us live through various different mediums, one of those being www.trinitychannel.com, tell a neighbor, tell a friend, tell a family member, tell a coworker, tell everyone, because this information is information that needs to be out in the public. There needs to be discussion about these things. Muslims, they need to answer these questions for your own self. If you're a committed Muslim, how can you be committed to Islam, committed to the cause of Allah and his messenger, making a prayer 5 times a day, knowing that you're facing a Qibla that was not even used by your Salaf, as-Salih, your predecessors. They were facing a different direction. And we've been talking about this, and next we're going to direct our question to Beth Grove. What is the importance and significance of Petra? What's so important about Petra?
Yes, and remember when Sara said that, and she just gave that list after list after list of Qiblas, the direction of prayer, all pointing towards Petra, not pointing towards Mecca. What is interesting about that is till 725, all of the Qiblas pointed uniformly to Petra. It wasn't that they were off a few degrees or one was facing this way and one was facing that way. Uniformly, they pointed towards Petra. Even as far as Guangzhou, before Muhammad died, apparently it was built in 630, and that Qibla points towards Petra. How does a mosque in China, in Guangzhou, how does that point towards Petra, has a Qibla, and yet Islam had not even gone that far at this time. It took many more years to actually get as far as China. What is interesting, when you go to North Africa, all of those Qiblas face south. I would love to see if there's going to be an archaeological discovery that there may be another citadel, another important citadel where the traders would go somewhere in North Africa. That would be a really fascinating discovery. What we're finding is that the Qiblas all pointed towards one of the big superpowers of the time. We know that Petra was the heart of the Nabatean kingdom. We know also the 3 cities that Sara pointed to. Remember, she talked about Ad, Thamud, and Midian. All of these were part of the Nabatean kingdom. They were all 600 miles north of Mecca. And when it talks about Muhammad and the Muslims apparently interacting with these people, they were far too north for them to have come very closely from Mecca. So the idea, for example, that they could have traveled overnight for 600 miles really could not have happened. So it looks like all of the events that we see in the Quran, all of the events that we see in early Islam probably happened much more north. If you look, for example, at the list of, or the description of the mother of all settlements, apparently the city that everyone prays to now, and the place that, as Jay said earlier, that Abraham went to, and of course, where every mosque now points towards, that is Mecca. When you look at those descriptions, as Sara, I believe, pointed out, she talked about it was in a valley, or was this Jay? It doesn't matter who it was. In a valley with a parallel valley, with a stream, fields, clay, loam, with olive trees. And as we've pointed out earlier, that's all Mediterranean. It's not in a hot, arid desert down where Mecca is. And of course, near the Pillar of Salt, which is much more north, where the biblical stories happen. All of these descriptions don't describe Mecca. They don't describe Mecca at all. They describe Petra. And as we pointed out earlier, if you look at Petra, it's right at the heart where if you were to go north, you'd be going up into Palestine. You're going to what we now know today as Turkey. Of course, you could go into Europe. Of course, these are not what they were called in those days. If you go west, you go to Africa. If you go east, you go to Persia and India. If you go south, you go down into Arabia. And Petra is right where all the trade routes cross over, north, south, and east and west, and it's right there at that little point of land that also goes off into Egypt. And so this is probably that where all the traders would go and worship their particular idols. We know that traders from many different nations would come to a city that had temples and idols. And of course, we know in Islamic tradition, apparently the Kaaba had 300 idols. And we know that Petra was a place of idol worship. And of course, it also has an idol called Allah, who had daughters, all of which are also in the Quran, al-Manat, etc. And so these idols that are also mentioned in the Quran, and this name Allah, which was, we know, a Nabatean god with a Mrs. God called Allat. And it's interesting that the Islamic god is called Allah. We know this is a Nabatean pagan god. If you look at the rituals that Muslims now do in Mecca when they go on the pilgrimage, those rituals are pre-Islamic. They are pre-Islamic pagan practices. They are what we know people, for example, like the Nabateans, would practice when they did their pilgrimages, where they'd run between two mountains. They'd wear a cloth that's all one cloth, as Muslims do when they go on the Hajj, where they would go around the Kaaba, where they would throw stones at the devil. All these interesting pre-pagan practices that are now at the heart of one of the most important pillars of Islam. So the significance of everything being Petra, it all fits together. Do you see how it's all fitting together? The trade route is Petra. The direction of prayer is Petra. We know that Mecca was not on any map. But of course, we know Petra definitely was on a map. The descriptions of the holy settlement, of the important settlement, all fit Petra. None of them fit Mecca. And this is causing or raising huge, very significant, very important questions. Now, Muslims might say, well, why would it suddenly change? Now, Jay knows a lot more about this, where the reasons of why there had to be a sudden change, which I think he'll talk about in a minute. But it's just fascinating to see that Islam had this particular traditional history, but archaeological evidence, documentary evidence, and just looking at maps of the ancient world, looking at the spices that were traded, looking at the descriptions of what this early settlement, this early city or citadel was, it all points towards Petra, and it all points to someone who it looks like now started Islam. That was 60 years after Muhammad. Remember, the term Islam, the term Muhammad, and the city of Mecca, none of it begins to be referenced until 60 years after Muhammad died in 632. It all starts in 690. It all starts 690, 691, where a huge, big building was built in Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock. The first Quranic inscriptions that we have today are on the Dome of the Rock. The first references to Islamic theology, although interestingly a little different from the Quran today, the first Quranic verses we have, but slight variations from the one they have today, it all starts with the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, 691, by a leader called Abd al-Malik. And it could be, and this is where the evidence is pointing, it could be that Abd al-Malik is the founder of Islam.
Wow. Now, folks, are you paying attention? Are you listening? Are you writing this down? Make sure you see the show, look it up on YouTube after it's done. It's posted up on YouTube, on Trinity Channel's page on YouTube. Very important stuff. While you were speaking, it came to mind, I know there are various narrations and stories. I don't know how true they are. I don't even know if Muslims themselves consider them to be all that authentic about Muhammad, being claimed that Muhammad traveled with his uncle on caravans in his youth until he was a young man and things like that. I wonder if someone named Muhammad actually lived. Did he actually pass through Petra? Did he go to the city of Petra? All types of questions are being raised here. Now, let's go to Jay. Jay, how do we conclude? How do we come to some type of closure with this historical findings that we have today? What should we draw from this?
Okay. I think now we've set you the scene. Now you're going to ask, how do you make sense of it all? Yeah. Before I even answer that, I want to back up to the very beginning. Take a look at Islam as of what we now know about what Islam is in the context of this man, Muhammad. What we know is it's a very sophisticated religion. Are we not right, CL?
Yes.
We know that it is a religion that has immensely sophisticated laws, rules, regulations, 4 schools of law, the Hanafi, the Shafi, the Maliki, the Hanbali school. These are laws that would only work in an urban environment, in large cities. Yet this Muhammad came from a hamlet. This Muhammad came from a nomadic existence. There were no cities in Arabia. Even that by the 9th century there were no big cities in Arabia. So you've got a real problem here, because obviously you've got to back up and say, where did this great sophisticated religion with all these rules and regulations concerning dietary codes, concerning all these relational codes, all this material about how a sewer and laws about finances that were based on taxation codes that only make sense in a large urban environment that doesn't exist in the central part of Arabia called the Hijaz. And that's why Patricia Corona was asking this question. So was Dr. Hotting, and so was Dr. Wansberg. They said this such a sophisticated religion could not have existed in such a barbaric, pagan, and in many respects very backward environment like it would have been in the 7th century in Arabia. So let's run forward and let's see what did happen. Well, this is what we do know. We do know that the Arabs were stopped from going into the Sassanid area by the Lakhmids. These are the garrison towns. These are the groups that were paid by the Sassanids to keep the Arabs in the desert. In the north, they were stopped from going into the Byzantine area by the Ghassanids. So you had the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids who kept the Arabs in the desert, keeping them from going to these two large empires. As long as those two border states were paid, they did their job. But the Sassanids and the Byzantines, remember, as I said earlier, they were warring for 200 years, from the 5th, 6th, up until the 7th century. They ran out of money. They could no longer keep paying the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids. So the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids just let the Arabs go where they wanted. These were raiders on camels. They loved booty. And so they moved right into the vacuum that existed. We do know, and this is all based on fact, the historical history tells us that these Arabs who call themselves Saracens, they call themselves Maghribites, they call themselves Ishmaelites, they call themselves Hagarenes, they call themselves Muhajiruns, as Beth said. Those are the 5 names they call themselves. They never referred to themselves as Muslims. They quickly come in and they take over Basra, then Baghdad, then Damascus, then Jerusalem, and then Cairo, the great 5 cities of the Levant by 642. So they've taken over these large cities, but they are nomadic. They don't live in cities. They've never been part of a cosmopolitan area. So they live outside the cities. But someone's got to keep control of those cities. Someone's got to maintain the taxation and all these structures and the social systems that were in place. Someone's got to maintain, otherwise it'd be total chaos. So what the Arabs did is they used their cousins, Jews and Christians, who were educated. They were the best educated to continue to maintain control of the cities. And that worked very well, because both the Arabs who come from Ishmael and Hagar saw the Jews and Christians as brothers, cousins, because they both traced their lineage back to Abraham. That's why they used them. They were urbanites. They knew how to run the cities. They knew how to run the treasuries. They knew how to do the taxation. They knew how to read and write. They also could then codify and keep all the caliphal protocols in place. And this is why you then see these Arabs then continue to move out, take over more cities. They start moving across North Africa all the way to Spain in the west, and they go the other direction, past the Sassanids all the way to India in the east. So by the time that Abd al-Malik comes to power, he comes to power in 680. He is part of the Marwanid Caliphate. And from 680 to 705, he's in power. He is the greatest of all the Umayyad Caliphates. He is the one that realizes now that his family has been in power for about 40 years, yet he doesn't have a prophetic line. Those that have been working for them as indentured servants, so to speak, they call them Mawalis and Mawalis. They had been running the cities. They had been running the empire. They had a prophetic line. Their line comes from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if you look at the Quran, of the 25 prophets, 19 of them come in that line. And they had an identity through their prophethood. But the Arabs didn't have a prophet. Remember, there is no prophet through the line of Ishmael. The Arabs were always dependent on these Jews and Christians for their prophet. They needed an Arab prophet. They needed their own Arab identity. They ruled everything now. From Spain to India was under their control. And yet they had nothing in their lineage, nothing in their culture, nothing that they could say gave them that identity. That's why Abd al-Malik, very important, Abd al-Malik decides to create an Arab identity. And he is known as the great Arab reformer. He takes the coins. You go to the numismatic section here in the British Museum. Look at all the coins. All the caliphal coins, they have images on them of themselves. Why would they have images if images is anathema in Islam, unless there were no problem with images that early? He takes the image of himself off his coin, and in 691 he introduces a new coin with Arabic script on it. And look and see what he writes on that Arab coin. In 691, he puts the Shahada. He introduces the Shahada. That's the first time we see any reference to Muhammad. But he doesn't just do it on the coin. He's way up in Damascus. Remember, he's living in Damascus. Why Damascus, people should ask? Why is no one asking these questions? What is he doing way up north in Damascus if he should be down in Mecca? That's 1,200 miles away. And more than that, where is the seat of the Judeo-Christianity? The seat of Judeo-Christianity is Jerusalem. So therefore he builds a building in Jerusalem. He builds the largest building of its day, the Dome of the Rock. Look and see where he builds it. He builds it across the valley from the Church of the Sepulchre, which is the seat of Christianity, which is the seat of Byzantine Christianity. It is the superpower of its day, Byzantine Christianity. What are you going to do if you're going to fight against Byzantine Christianity? What are you going to do? You're going to go to their holy city, and you're going to build a building above theirs across the valley on a higher ridge. That's where the Dome of the Rock is built, on the higher ridge, looking down on the Church of the Sepulchre. They are now one-upping the Christians, the Byzantine Christians. But more than that, then you write about what is it you're talking about. So the only original part that still exists in the Dome of the Rock today are the two ambulatories that are there in the center. These are two circles of arches. And that's where the inscriptions are. And we have seen those inscriptions, and we're looking at those inscriptions. Now, if you were to ask any Muslim why the Dome of the Rock was built, they will say it's built because this is where this is where Muhammad, in the night of power, was woken up in the middle of the night in 621. He was told to get on the back of the winged horse called the Burak, and he flies up to Jerusalem. And from Jerusalem, he goes up to 7 heavens up to meet Allah. And that's where he gets the 50 prayers, comes down to heavens, meets Moses, and he says that's way too many prayers. And so he bounces back and forth between Allah and Moses, getting it down from 50 to 45, 35, 15, 10, 5 prayers. And that's called the Miraj. That's why the building was built, to commemorate that event. But look at all the inscriptions on the Dome of the Rock, and you won't see a reference, any reference to the Miraj. No reference to that event. What is on those inscriptions? Listen, I'm not telling you anything new. You already know this, CL. You know where I'm going with this. Take a look at those inscriptions. They're all or mostly against Jesus Christ. These are a polemic against our Lord and Savior. Abdul Malik was putting that building there to confront the Church of the Sepulchre, to confront Byzantine Christianity, to confront the divinity of Jesus Christ. Surah 4, Ayah 171, say not three. There's confronting the Trinity, for God is one, and he has no son. There he's confronting the supposed polytheism of Christianity, and supposedly he's confronting right head on the sonship of Jesus Christ. He's confronting us. And that's why it has to be built there. And what does he do? He then introduces the Shahada, which he's introduced on the coins. He introduces it on that ambulatory. And it's Surah 3, Ayah 64. But it's not quite the same Shahada that we have today. There's only one God but God, and he has no partners. That's not part of the Shahada. And Muhammad is his prophet. Whose he has no partners against? Well, that's from Surah 5, Ayah 72. That's against Jesus again. So when you look at that ambulatory, that building was built to confront Christianity, to confront the divinity of Jesus Christ, to confront the Trinity, to confront the sonship of Jesus Christ. Everything we know about what we believe, Abdul Malik is now confronting. And he's now saying it's not that prophet, it is now my prophet. And his name is Muhammad. And he, along with Allah, which Beth has just mentioned, look at Allah, is the wrong name. They should never have used Allah. Allah is a Nabatean name. Allah is a Nabatean God. Allah has always been there. Allah has a wife named Alat, the feminine form of Allah, has a daughter named Al-Madat and Al-Uzza. Take a look at Surah 53, Ayah 19 and 20, the satanic verses, and you get those 3 names. Ooh, those are the 3 goddesses of Allah. But what Muslims say, now they're introducing a monotheistic God. Hold on a minute. If God has no son, then what's he doing with a daughter? In Surah 6, Ayah 101, it says that God has no wife. Then what's he doing with Alat? Bingo, you've got a real problem here. But they weren't thinking this through when they chose Allah. Nonetheless, can you see, once you now introduce your prophet, a prophet has to have a book, has to have a revelation. Every prophet has revelation. So where's this revelation? So that's why the beginning of the Quran starts to get written down. These inscriptions along the Dome of the Rock are the earliest Quranic material we can find. That's the earliest Quranic material we can find. Then you need to look at the manuscripts. Now, we've not even bothered to look at the manuscripts tonight. That's a whole nother talk. But let me just tell you what we now know. The manuscripts of the Quran begin to appear in the 8th century. They begin to appear at the time of Abdul Malik's son Al-Walid, who ruled from 705 to 710. He is the first one to start to introduce these manuscripts. Why? Because Abdul Malik now realizes he's got to have a revelation. That revelation has to come. Has to be an Arab revelation in the Arab language with an Arab prophet. So you have the prophet, now you need his revelation. That's why they had to borrow right, left, and center. And what did they borrow? Well, they borrowed what was already there. As we said earlier this afternoon, all these borrowing are actually apocryphal writings, most of them Jewish apocryphal writings. A lot of them are Christian sectarian writings written in Syriac. That's why you get the name Issa, the wrong name. That is not an Arabic name. They shouldn't have used Issa. They should have used Yeshua. Nonetheless, they've had to borrow right, left, and center. There looks like there are different codices that belong to different cities. You have the Codex of Ubay ibn Ka'b that becomes very popular in Damascus. You have the Codex of Ibn Masud that becomes very popular in Baghdad. You have the Codex of Ibn Musa that becomes very popular in Basra. And then you have the mother one, the Codex of Zayd ibn Thabit that becomes very popular in Medina. So you have 4 different codices in 4 different cities known as the Metropolitan Codices, which Arthur Jeffrey has talked about since the 1930s. There is reference after reference to these 4 codices plus another 11 codices that existed as we look at the Islamic tradition. So there's obviously an awful lot of competition as to which are these codices. Here's what's interesting. Take a look at the manuscripts of the earliest manuscripts of the Quran today. The Topkapi, which is in Istanbul, that is dated to 749, mid-8th century. The Hosseini, which is in Cairo, that is dated to the 9th century. The Petropolitan's manuscript, which is in Paris, that is dated to the early 8th century. The Ma'il manuscript, which is in London, that is dated to the early to mid-8th century. Then you have one of the most exciting ones, and that is the Sana manuscript, which is in Yemen. That is dated to the early 8th century, and then the 6th one, the last one, is the Samarkand, which is in Tashkent. Take a look at those 6 manuscripts. That Tashkent one is early to mid 8th century. Have you noticed? I've not said 7th century once. They're all 8th century manuscripts. Take a look at those 8th century, those 6 manuscripts. Not one of them agrees with each other. Not one of them is complete, and every one of them has manuscript variants. That means they have words and phrases that are different than the Quran that we have today, the 1924 manuscript that was canonized less than 100 years ago in Cairo at Al-Azhar University. Now, stop and ask. No wonder these manuscripts don't agree. We've only known about this for 2 years because this is the beginning of where the Quran is put together. You've got the man, Muhammad. You've got to give him a book. That starts to be put together. There's lots of differences between them. They start changing, erasing, and inserting other words, erasing and inserting other words, taping over top, putting coverings over top. That's where Dr. Dan Brubaker has now filmed these. He's found 800 of these corrections in these 6 major manuscripts. He's found 800 corrections where they're standardizing the text, and these corrections continue up until the 9th century. That makes sense now. That's why it took them up about 100 to 150 years to finally get the Quran so it was standardized. And what we think now, it looks like the Topkapi became the standard form. But even the Topkapi has 2,270 manuscript variants from the Quran we have today. So even by the mid-8th century, they still not have finished the Quran. They haven't standardized it. And that's why you have so many contradictions in the Quran. And that's why also it does not agree with the Quran we have today. Now, you've got the man, you've got the book. You've got to put him in a place. Well, the place they put him is Petra. Petra was fine. Petra has been the Nabatean, seat of the Nabateans. From the 2nd century BC, it was the seat of the Nabatean kingdom. It is where the temples and the tombs are. So it was their sanctuary. So you just incorporated their sanctuary. But then in 713, an earthquake comes and destroys Petra. Once the earthquake destroys Petra, you can no longer have the sanctuary there. That means God's presence is no longer there. So what do? You change and you put it down to where you come from. Remember, the Marwan family, of which Abdul Malik and Al-Walid are part of. They're part of the Marwanid family of the Umayyad Caliphate. They are from the Hijaz, from the central part of Arabia. That's why they then had to move the Qibla, move the sanctuary down to Mecca, because Mecca was probably there. In fact, I would suggest that those things that Beth was talking about, them running around 7 times, going back and forth between the Marwa and Safa hills, and The Jamarats throwing stones at 3 devils. Since where are there 3 devils in the Quran? There's only 1 devil. But that was probably pagan, pre-Islamic pagan rituals that they now incorporated. That's where their family had their sanctuary, and that's why they chose Mecca. Now can you understand why 725, all the mosques start to change towards Mecca? But it takes them 100 years to get that uniform all over the kingdom, all over the empire. So it's not till 822 that everything now begins to face towards Mecca. Now, you've got the man, you've got the book, you've got the place. You've now got to have the history. You've got to make the story. That's why now nothing gets written down till 833. Ibn Hisham is the one that finally puts the story of who this prophet is and what he did. And that's why there's so many historical anachronisms. That's why it gets so exciting. Once you get the story written down, then you've got to have the sayings. And that's why Al-Bukhari is given 600,000 of these sayings in 850. And between 850 and 870, the next 20 years, he then throws out almost 98% of it, only retains 2% of it. About 7,300 or about 7,400 of those sayings are then incorporated in 870. After him comes Sahih Muslim, but they don't come before Bukhari. They all come after Bukhari. And then we get finally the Tafsir Tariq in the 10th century. 9th century. 10th century, 923. So here you have everything now in place by the time the 10th century comes into play. By the 10th century, everything we know about the man, the book, the place, also about the history and the sayings, all finally get finalized. And that's why you then get the 4 schools of law. The 4 schools of law are introduced by Al-Shafi in 820. We don't have anything before 820. It is the 9th century again. It's therefore Islam as we know it did not come from a man named Muhammad. You asked a very good question, CL. Did he even exist? I believe he did, because we do have references to him outside of Islamic material. We have the Doctrine of Iacobi from 634. We also have the writings of Sabaeus and from 660. These are writings from Christians that are writing about this man named Muhammad, but they don't really say much about him. They just say have nothing to do with him because he's a warrior. Therefore, they don't refer to him as a prophet. They don't talk to him about as being a Muslim. They don't refer to any religion called Islam. And they most curiously, they don't say anything about the Quran, nor do they talk about Mecca. All of that comes later. Therefore, created to create that Arab identity. Abd al-Malik starts that Arab identity, introduces the coin, puts up the Dome of the Rock, introduces Muhammad's name for the first time. Then he starts confronting Christianity. Then he starts to put the Quran together. And that's why the Quran starts to proliferate from the 8th century on. There's lots of differences between those Qurans. We're only finding that out in the last 2 years. And that's why it's so exciting. Looks like Islam did not come from a man named Muhammad. It did not come in a period of 22 years, like Muslims would like to believe us. It comes in a period of maybe 100 to 200 years, maybe even more. But what if that is the case? Then who in the world is Muhammad, and what's his purpose?
That's a question that our viewers are going to have to ask themselves and look into. You've been given a lot of information and a lot of data to research and look into. And number of references to look up for yourselves. Don't just take the words of me or anyone else or the guests. Look for yourself. Investigate for yourself. Find collaborating evidence and ask questions for yourself. We've come to the end of the show. This has been an excellent show. I've learned things that I didn't even know today on this show. And with the last few, maybe minute or two that we have very little time left. Can I just get a closing statement from our 2 guests that are left? Because I think Sara dropped off. From Beth and Jay, could you just give us a closing statement very quickly?
Yeah, Sarah's internet closed. That's why she's not on. Yes, very quickly. If you look at what we've talked about tonight, we have used neutral criteria. We've not used Christian arguments tonight. We've not used theological arguments. We have used criteria that is neutral, that is secular. We have asked the questions of the Quran that we also ask of the Bible. These questions that we ask of the Quran, I as a Christian, I have asked them of the Bible because I don't want to follow something that is not true. I want to follow something that I know is historically accurate, that has foundation in history, that can be corroborated by peoples, places, and events being corroborated by archaeology, documentary, and manuscript evidence. So we've applied that to the Bible. We also apply that to the Quran. When you look at the Bible, you'll see that there is no archaeological discovery that has ever gone against a properly understood biblical statement. That is the quote of an archaeologist. No archaeological discovery has ever gone against a properly understood biblical statement. That is profound. We don't have that with the Quran at all. Tonight, I think we've shown that you look at archaeological evidence, you look at documentary and manuscript evidence, that it all points to a different story than what Islam in the Quran and in the traditions say. That means that Islam doesn't have a history. Islam is not a book that comes from a God who knows history. Islam is a book that comes from man-made traditions, probably for, and most likely it all points towards political power and political struggle, using God to gain credence and to gain strength in that time, part of the world. The Bible, on the other hand, is archaeologically accurate. The documents prove what the Bible says over and over again. So we can weigh this up then, ask the same questions of both books and see which book is from God, which book is historically reliable. If it is historically reliable, then we can look at its message and see that its message is trustworthy, its message is worth understanding and unpacking. And I say that's the Bible, but it's certainly not the Quran.
Jay, will you give us a last word? We have a small amount of time left. Could you just wrap this up for us real quickly?
I think Beth did such a good job. I almost don't know what to say after what she just did. But let me just say this to any Muslims who are watching. You notice, as Beth said, this is not a Christian polemic. This is a neutral historical polemic. We're not saying anything that you cannot investigate. Everything we've introduced tonight, you can investigate. It always comes down, when you look at Christianity and Islam, both Christianity and Islam are based on a man and a book. We are absolutely dependent on the Bible, the gospel of Jesus Christ, on the Jesus himself. That's our man, that's our book. Jesus is historical. No one even questions whether he exists or not. We know where he lived, we know what he did, we know what he said, we know how he died, and we even know how he rose again. These are not in question except possibly the resurrection. Nothing else other than that is in question. What we're showing you tonight is the man in the book that you have, the book, the Quran, and the man Muhammad, now do not stand up to historical scrutiny. We don't know who Muhammad was. I'm sure he did live, but he's not the man of history. He is the man of faith. The man you're talking about, I don't recognize. The book you're talking about, I can't even find in the 7th century. This is not a book that's eternal. This is not a book that comes to one man, and it's certainly not a book that was written by God. It is written, looks like, by failed men, as Beth said. I ask you, and I implore you, give up that book, give up that man, and come on home. Come home to a bigger book, a better book, a bigger book called the Bible. This is it right here. And come on back to Jesus Christ. We've got the man of history. We've got the book of history. We give him to you.
Amen. Amen. Wonderful show and wonderful guests and a wonderful audience. It's been a great time that I've had today dialoguing with everyone in YouTube. Please continue to pray for the Trinity Channel. Pray about supporting the Trinity Channel, and please continue to view our programming that we're putting out here. No place else are you going to get information like this. Not in mainstream media, only here. And we thank you. Have a blessed night. Your friend, C.L. Edwards. Thank you.